Hi, it's very nice to be here. It's very nice that you're here, and thanks very much for asking me to talk. It's kind of appropriate we're here in the shed because the shed is here as a temporary theatre. Now it's in fact extended until 2017. But the idea of it was that it would be our temporary third theatre while the Cottesloe closed for refurbishment and being turned into the Dolphin. But we didn't write the money for the shed into the budget for the NT Future Capital Works. So we had to make the money, and we made the money by doing Warhorse in New York. So there was something really lovely, rather poetic about the idea that the most successful commercial production the National Theatre has ever done, by going to New York, by our being involved in it, by our co-producing it and raising some of the money for it, would produce about £2 million profit, which we could use, some of which we could use, about £1.5 million to build this building. And the unit that now in the National Theatre is responsible for our commercial productions, National Theatre Productions, is at the studio. So there is a very neat circular relationship between, in one organisation, the idea that there's no tension between work and how it's produced, how it's developed experimentally, and the means which later on it's funded by the exploitation of that work. So I'm a passionate believer that there is no tension between the subsidised and the commercial, and that the idea that there should be a binary distinction between these two things is false. It's often, I think, been thought to be a new thing that subsidised theatres should be responsible for their own work. Actually, it has been going on for some time. The Almeida, when I was at the Almeida, we produced a number of shows into the West End. It was a misconception that through the Charity Commission you weren't actually allowed to take risk with your own money. But that's not been the case. The Charity Commission has always taken the view that you should make best use of your charitable assets. And in the late 90s, the Almeida produced Judas Kiss, and then transferred Naked and the Iceman Cometh into the West End, and then it did a season at the Albury Theatre. It's really about risk and capacity, and the decision is really about whether you have those things and you have the appetite for risk. The big turning point, I think, for the National Theatre was when we did History Boys, which was done in the Littleton in 2005. Nick Salmon, very distinguished commercial producer with Playful, came to see me, we talked about it. And I realised, as Nick sat on my sofa, that it was a complete no-brainer that we should do it ourselves. I was just the victim of some bit of conceptual rationalism that somehow the furthest a subsidised theatre could go at that point would be to talk to a commercial producer and do a sort of partnership, even though at the Almeida we had been 100% responsible for our own work. And I did a terrible thing to Nick, which was just to look at him and look at the appetite in his eyes and think, it's going to cost about £200,000 to put this show on. The National Theatre's turnover at that time was about £40 million, something like that. Why is that a risk? We knew that it was sold out. Why wouldn't we do it ourselves? And that was a real turning point, because it was so obvious we should, and we put the case tentatively to our board, over-tentatively, as if it was a huge sort of category change, which it really isn't. Why, if you're taking risks all the time here, this big organisation, wouldn't you want, if you felt you had the appetite and the skills, the expertise and the love for the show, why wouldn't you want to do it yourself? And that's not shoving aside commercial producers, that's just having a proper relationship with your own work. If you can do it best by giving your show to a commercial producer, then that's what you should do. But if it's the best thing, if you can look after your show best, if you can, at very high quality, extend its reach and as a blended objective, as a twin goal, contribute to your bottom line, then why not do it yourselves? And that sort of movement to do that, I think, has been wholly positive. And it's probably just worth just noting that the returns, the commercial returns, typically used to be 3% royalty and 10% net profits when an organisation like the National Theatre, as it absolutely did up until just a few years ago, gave its shows over to commercial producers. And there are people here in the audience who have served those shows extremely well, Peter being the most illustrious example of that. But the returns are much greater if the National Theatre hangs on to the show itself. And if you can create those conditions, and also crucially, I think, you can calibrate the relationship that you wish to have with the creative team. And we've tried in putting together Warhorse, One Man, Two Governors, and Curious Incident to try and think about how the rewards flow best to the people who made the show. It's, I think, very important not to think that it's about you, the organisation. It's about the artists who make the show, and just the joy of returning to those artists money which will allow them to carry on. And given that the context is probably that you haven't paid them enough in the first place. So when we distribute profits back to writers, actors, directors, and so on, and we do it now through NT Live as well as our commercial producers, there's a really good and healthy thing. And I just want to make the point, and I think Lynn's going to make it actually, which is that money is not a dirty thing. I was brought up by Richard Eyre here, who was running the National Theatre, with the nostrum, and I think such a good one, that an art decision is a money decision, and a money decision is an art decision. And I deprecate people who feel that their role is either on the money side or on the art side. That's absolutely fair enough if that's quite clearly where you are. But the producer role surely is to straddle those two things and see quite responsibly how the decisions are made seamlessly. So making people money is something we should try to do. It's often thought that the commercial theatre needs the subsidised theatre hugely, and it does. But the subsidised theatre needs the commercial theatre hugely as well, because we don't pay enough in order to sustain careers at the level, at the calibre, and on the length that would that simply would not be possible on the kind of fees that get paid in the subsidised world. There is a very precise and healthy synergy between these two, between the commercial and the non-profit, I should say. And as you look around the world, you think, well, the other big theatre capital is New York. And I think it's really instructive to see how New York doesn't work that way. That actually innovation is not thriving as fully as it should, as you'd expect it to in the non-profit world. And I think there's a very particular paradox there, which is that the irony is that state funding creates the best possible conditions for innovation and rule breaking. Private funding in New York, with tax breaks from private donations, produces a non-profit theatre which largely is chasing success, not chasing innovation. The motivation is wrong. There's remarkably little innovation going on in, no, I should say not remarkably little, I should say relatively little innovation going on in New York theatre compared with the way it's happening in London. We are in the most wonderful city for making theatre. There's nothing that you can't do. And actually, events like this that encourage people to innovate and think about different ways of turning models are a really good idea. Very, very good idea. I want to go back to History Boys just to say what we have got wrong along the way. And it was a mindset problem. Easy to think that your goal is to get your show into the West End or into commercial theatre or whatever. And from the Almeida and with a subsidised mindset, our goal was to say, let's have a great 16-week run at Wyndham's. And then when we put it on tour, we said, oh, we could do another 16-week run at Wyndham's. Wrong, wrong, wrong. We should have said, that's a show which has obvious legs in the commercial theatre. We should have set it up to be able to run. We didn't set it up to run. We set it up with something which I think was unexamined and possibly had a bit of vanity at the bottom of it, that it would be good enough to have a big success for 16 weeks. But that wasn't the right relationship with the commercial theatre, and I think it's important that we should be incredibly respectful about the way things work. People need to make money. Theatres need to run. You can't just take your show off after 16 weeks because you fancy it. You're not proper. That's not serious. So when we've set up things like, well, obviously Warhorse, but also Curious Incident, One Man, Two Governors, with that sense of having got that wrong with History Boys in one's mind, we've set them up to run. Now, you've no idea whether they will run, but don't set them up merely to be limited runs, because it does some people some good, but it's not as engaged with an audience and with the artists who made the work as it could be. The National Theatre's reach last year was 3.6 million people saw work directly produced by the National Theatre, and that was because of playing to about 800,000 people here. I can't think what the number was in the West End. Robin, you might remember it.
That's
a million, something like a million.
More than a million.
More than a million.
Yeah. In
the West End, and we've got a very big touring programme going out at the moment. We've got Warhorse and One Man, Two Governors, and then Curious Innocents going out after that. But it was also because of broadcasting into cinemas. And I just want to mention that because that was a commercial subsidised model, or a non-profit commercial bit of innovation. Each broadcast takes between £200,000 and £300,000 to put on, and they're now well breaking even within the UK alone. As you probably know, we're extending this out to other partners broadcasting other work, because the appetite for that appears to be very, very strong and is growing very rapidly. And luckily, very fortunately, there is some research just arriving, about to be press released, from Nesta, which shows that there are positive impacts as a stimulus to theatre going from cinema broadcasts, and that the cannibalisation of theatre audiences by cinema broadcasts is not a negative impact. In fact, the news is mildly positive, that there appears to be a stimulus upon people's appetite to see theatre. As it happened, we were able to fund the startup of NT Live by a grant from the Arts Council and a small amount of money from Nesta, and it had the goal that it had to break even within a year, which it managed to do. That kind of innovation of business model points towards, I think, a future which is exciting, because elsewhere, particularly amongst smaller companies, there is evidence, I think, of people being motivated in non-ideological ways about money. We've had a very enjoyable relationship with Punch Drunk and helped them put together a funding package for The Drowned Man, which was really an example of social investment and social enterprise investment. That is, where the people are looking for a return, but they're also looking for excellent work going on. And that kind of movement, I think, is going to be coming to be more and more in our lives, which I wholly applaud. I think I'd really like to say in conclusion that I think that probably the keynote is a kind of respect that, and what I sort of urge, and what I think I've tried to learn, is that we are not in a binary. We don't find ourselves in a subsidised camp or a commercial camp, merely having airless conversations across that divide. We're in a huge industry which is ever more popular, and where we find things are not working, we should try and find more and more adventurous ways of just getting the work on. There are lots of things about the current commercial theatre that appear to me to be broken and static. But there is so much energy and there is so much talent in London. And as I say, I do think it's the best theatre in the world that you could possibly have for putting on theatre. That where the innovation needs to come alongside the artistic innovation is just the pressure of getting the work on. And we should really think about the binary of commercial or non-profit. We should just think, that doesn't matter. I'm just going to find a way of doing it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I thought I'd kick off by asking a question and then open it up to the floor for questions. My question, I think, is when you're thinking about work that you've done at the National and what its life beyond the National might be, how are you making decisions about which shows? And because you've got your range of shows here, lots and lots of successful shows, some of which have had future lives and some of which haven't. There are some shows that I've seen here which I would love to have seen more of.
Yeah.
And is that a risk? Is that about risk, or is that just about circumstance? How those decisions are made?
I think what we're trying to constantly challenge ourselves to say, if there appears to be an audience for a show, not to try and put a show in a category in advance of that decision. To say, so here's an example, and I'd love to know which shows you think should have had further life. So James Graham wrote a play called This House about 1970s coalition politics. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Could you have predicted that that would be a hit? Absolutely not. It was great production by Jeremy Herrin, moved into the Olivier, and we tried like stink to get that to transfer, and we failed. There were no theatres available. There was one that we thought we were going to get, and we missed it. That was real passion. That was real. We did an NT Live of it. I think it was the first NT Live that you thought, it's extraordinary. 45,000 people were turning out to see that in cinemas, and they didn't have any, as it were, stars in it. So it's extraordinary. So you could see that there was a show there that you had an appetite for, and you wanted just to respond to it.
Yeah.
And we would have done it pretty much on any terms. I mean, we tried to set things up in National Theatre Productions so that they are at least likely to break even or do better than that. But our mission is first and foremost to extend the reach, and then secondly to make a contribution. So, long answer to your question, which is, I think we've probably missed shows all the way along the line. The Amen Corner, another great show, it should have had a further life. The Pillow Man missed its further life earlier on. So I think, of course, it needs to respond to whether there's theatre availability, and at the moment there's very little theatre availability.
Yeah.
So clearly we need to find different spaces to put shows on in, and preferably cheaper spaces where the drinks are good and they're not expensive, and there's some leg room and maybe some air conditioning, and what else would you like? If you're producers, you don't want to pay private property seats, and maybe if you're buying a ticket, maybe you just like to pay for the ticket but not pay for the other bit of the price of buying the ticket.
Nick, you should come to the regions.
That's right. And maybe you'd like...
There's space in the regions, come.
Yeah, okay, we are in the regions. Okay, but actually, it's interesting, isn't it? The London... Sorry, this is now going to be a point about London. I think theatre going is more popular even than we know it is.
Oh, I think it, yeah. There's some stat which I always try and find the answer to, which is about, and I'm a big football fan, which is about football attendance and theatre attendance, which is remarkably similar across the UK.
It is absolutely remarkable. And I think that if you think there are relatively high barriers to entry, and if you lower those barriers to entry, it's very interesting to see just how much more popular it becomes. So about 22 million people in London attend theatre every year. It's a huge number, way beyond the 14 million that the Society of London Theatre counts. But Alistair Smith has done some research on that. And the cinema broadcast is really interesting. I think that makes sense. I think many more people just never quite started going to the theatre, but it wasn't because they didn't like it, it was just it never quite happened for them. And if you make it more possible for people to go to the theatre, I think they do. So I think that argues that we do need more and different kinds of spaces where you can put shows on. And we're not going to be building more subsidised theatres. We could build more non-profit theatres. And I think it's just worth making the point that there are two major institutions, certainly in London, which are non-subsidised, mission-driven non-profits, and they are the Globe and the Old Vic. And it's interesting, we so rarely talk about that fact, and it's remarkable.
Yeah, and particularly the Globe, with the number of people through its doors and its business model, is a combination of commercial enterprise and private support and donation and philanthropy.
It's its own thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Why do you need to say that it's a combination of that?
Yeah,
It's just its own thing, and I think this territory of the mission-driven, non-subsidised, horrible phrase, but you see what I mean? It's a really interesting territory.
Yeah.
And London and the regions and the rest and the country has the capacity to to make theatre even more important.
Very good. Have we got questions from the floor? I'm going to moan like this. You there. You'll have to shout.
Talking about spaces for theatre to happen in, obviously you've mentioned Punch Drunk, but you're also currently doing one with the company Fuel, which is an outside production. I'm quite interested to find out how those relationships with those two companies arose with the National.
Yes. Well, Tom Morris introduced us to Punch Drunk. Nick went to see Firebird's Ball in, I don't know, 10 years ago, something like that. And then we were interested to see whether we could be of any help. And then we got involved in Faust and Mask of the Red Death, which was at BAC, which I was currently chairing. So that's how the relationship grew, really, and we discovered we quite like working together. And the role of the National is the sort of mindset of the National and those kind of things is to try and to be of productive help. The latest show, we didn't particularly want any billing on it, but Punch Drunk asked us to be billed alongside them. So what we tried to do is to find where, by doing possibly quite unglamorous things like simply selling the tickets, but thereby saving 8% of the box office, we can be of help. Fuel, well, we've known Kate for a similar amount of time. Again, I suppose a provenance back at BAC, and Kate came to see me and Robin about a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
Just to see whether we could get involved in that. And I think, it's a very natural role for the National Theatre to try and help things that are very easy for us to do, which are quite expensive or difficult for other people to do. Surely that's a role for a big organisation like this.
Thank you.
Very good. Next question down here.
Questions about touring, and you appear to have moved from a model where touring has been at a cost to the National to where it's now brings in income to the National. Is that true? And if so, what's driven that decision?
I'd say what I'd said before, really, which is that the goal is to extend the reach of the National Theatre and to take work at very high quality to as many people as we possibly can. And if you've got the shows to do it with, then the question is, do you need subsidy for that show? Do you not need subsidy for that show? Neil, who's sitting next to you, would, I hope, be very censorious of the National Theatre if it was using public subsidy to support shows that were capable of being on the road without public subsidy. And I would say very passionately that the fact of subsidy or the fact of developing a surplus doesn't change the nature of a show. Warhorse doesn't become a commercial show because it's played in the West End. It's the same show. The touring production of Warhorse is the best one I think I've ever seen, actually. It's phenomenally good. It hasn't denatured it because it spent 5 years in the West End. It's just a money thing. And the money is not totemic. It's just money. We've just got to get the best use of the money. So I would think it would be unconscionable to use public subsidy to subsidise a show that doesn't need subsidy. But there isn't a new model, because there is no new model in our world in terms that will create shows that the public wants to see. It's just the thing we know about, which is invested in research and development and emergent and so on and so on and so on. So no, it's not a new model. There's a patch of shows which are wanted to be seen, and we're capable of touring them without subsidy. That's all it is.
Nick, I wondered if you could explain the actual business model for the West End production companies that do put on Warhorse and on Anti-Governors and so forth. How are they actually constituted and financed?
It's very, very simple indeed, actually. It's that they are 100% owned by the National Theatre and 100% financed by the National Theatre and run out of a subsidiary, but not for reasons of avoiding liability, because obviously there's no question the National Theatre would obviously run away from debts, but simply for tax reasons, like any other trading subsidiary which kicks its profit back up to the charity. So we didn't raise money, we just decided, we looked at it on a risk basis and said, is the best thing we just put it on ourselves. The huge advantage of doing that, of course, is that you don't have these rather tedious separations that you have to sort of, in terms of cost centering. You can just say, this is what we should do. So you don't have to make decisions about how you allocate the cost and benefit of being in your brochure or whatever.
Yeah. So you're taking 100% of the risk and 100% of the income?
That's right,
yeah.
Yes. National angels are involved in Warble, so it's not quite the same on Warbles, but on One Man, Two Governors and Curious Incident it is, yeah. And I would urge people when, I suppose I'm just banging the same drum really, but when you're looking at these things, and I had to teach it to myself, and I felt like it took me years to really grasp the point, that it's just money, it's just risk. It doesn't change the nature of it. If you look at it and you say, as I said about History Boys, it was coming off a tours, it cost about 200,000 to put in, that was a completely reasonable risk for the National Theatre to take. And if you just look at the risk reward, why would you go and give a big chunk of that to somebody else?
What's National Angels?
National Angels is a group of donors to the National Theatre who about 10 years ago set themselves up in an enterprise investment scheme to co-produce theatre on terms that were considerably more beneficial to the producers than standard investment terms. And we did History Boys with them like that. We laid some of that risk off to them.
Just on the thing about National History Boys only cost 200,000 to get into the West End, I think thinking about how the West End model and the commercial touring model works in terms of what that pays for in terms of upfront costs versus running costs is a quite important thing, and that probably my guess is that people who are working in organisations that aren't raising money in that way don't necessarily think about the weekly running costs. So something like History Boys,
Yes.
the expectation is that it's going to sell extremely well, so there's a confidence about that. But on commercial doesn't necessarily equal profitable.
No.
And actually in the West End, majority of the time, it does not equal profitable.
No.
So what happens is that you've got running costs and you raise your money to get the show on, but then you have to hope that the box office is going to cover the running costs every week. And as soon as it doesn't, you're in trouble and you have to close, and that's why shows have to close. But at that point, the potential risk is often bigger than the cost of getting to the first night in the West End. And I think it's someone like you have that experience to understand the full risk of committing to a run in the West End.
Yeah.
Do you think that's an important consideration?
It's a very good point you make, that I'm talking about the, as it were, capitalisation of it, and then obviously you're responsible for the running. I suppose I'd still make a point which is, it's not rocket science. I mean, it's, as I say, one's respect is really much more to do with thinking properly about proper commercial decisions. But the money bit of it is, you know, we can all of us estimate how much things cost to run and what the profitability might be and what the risk might be. I think if you come from a non-profit world, I think one doesn't, it's not that one's made in a different way, but you're not capable or able to think about these things. So I wonder whether it's worth just underlining the point that it would appear to be non-subsidised or commercial spaces that are alternatives to the current theatre stock look as if they might be more necessary if work which is being produced that clearly should have a further audience is going to be seen by a public. And that might be an interesting form of innovation. And although London is fantastically expensive in real estate terms, nonetheless it does permit of all sorts of opportunities that crop up either on semi-permanent or purely temporary basis for having things which are pop-ups. And I think that way in which London does that is extraordinary. But anyway, that's too much about London.
One question here.
I suspect that lots of us are exploring these ideas from the position of working within a subsidised organisation in whatever form. And in all cases, the word risk generates enormous alarm bells in usually extremely risk-averse boards. Most of us will be dealing with very risk-averse boards, particularly currently. And I wondered if you had any advice on the words that we should use in talking to our boards and how to tackle it. Sorry.
The words you use.
And how to tackle this with our board mates. In other words, how to persuade them that this risk, in other words, how to talk about risk in a way that doesn't make it sound completely scary to make them stop listening to the word risk.
Well, it might be one of those cases where you shouldn't use words, you should use numbers. And a very simple chart that says, you know, here's the likely sunk cost, here's what the running cost is, and here's what it does at various percentages of capacity. And you could say, well, let's take a sort of low, high, and medium outcome. How much money is that? Is that money greater than our current reserves? What of our current reserves would be prepared to set against that as a risk? You know, just turn it into things which are not talk about it as concepts, but talk about it as you know, if you've got reserves of X and the largest serious downside is Y and Y is 10% of X, well, that sounds like quite a good risk. And if there are reasons of mission or objective of growth that would attach to doing it, then that's gonna tip the balance.
Do you think the Nationals model is scalable downwards?
Yeah, I know it is.
How do you know? Because you've got a portfolio, in the same way that a commercial producer would have a portfolio and would be spreading the risk. You can do that, whereas other organisations might be going in with, you know, they might be hanging out their shirts on one show, and that's not really a scalable model of risk management, or is it?
I don't think we've got a model. It isn't a model, because for it to be a model, we would have to have discovered something new about how to make shows which are popular. And we haven't. We've just got a, well, not just, but we need to carry on funding the National Theatre Studio, and we need to carry on putting shows on at the National Theatre without any premeditation whatsoever about whether they'll hit or not. That's what we need to do. And the commercial side of things has made up for the cuts in the Arts Council grant. And if Wars hadn't been there, and we hadn't been able to see that it was there, then the National Theatre would look entirely different, and we wouldn't be sitting here in this building, for instance. But I don't think that's a new model. I think that's an outlook. We haven't created, you know, I don't think there's anything new there except a way of looking at it. And there are ways of offsetting your risk. For instance, you could ask donors whether they would like to, well, if you have donors, but you could see whether you could take a position as a lead producer or as a co-producer and say, but we're not going to put any money into this ourselves, we're going to lay it all off. That's a possibility. Now, the capacity and time that would take to put that together might be greater than is worth it. But there are various different ways of doing it. But if you say to yourself, what are the different ways in which we could get this work to have a future life, that would be a good starting point.
Nick, you have a wonderful digital back catalogue of work that's been made over decades here. Do you believe at some point all that should become freely available and digitised and available for everybody for free?
Yes.
And at what point in a piece of work's life do you feel that should come into play?
I don't know. I don't know, because I think it's a developing picture. At the moment, we collectively are rather a long way behind on this because of, I think, principally a fear amongst probably the agents rather than the writers and the actors themselves. So, for instance, with NT Live, we inquired into the obvious thing, which was that people said, well, surely you're going to make a DVD, and it's the big question we get asked about Frankenstein. So we had to see. Now, we got a knockback on that from the actors. And actually that's very sensible because, and it was a blessing in disguise, I think, because the knockback was from the actors because we're capturing a theatrical performance. They are playing to an audience, and in the Olivier, you know, it's a big theatre, as you know. If you make something available on the DVD, and just bearing in mind, if you think about the American film, television, theatre industries, the first two on the West Coast largely, and the other one is on the East Coast. So you've got a lot of people who are potentially employing actors who are on British stages, who probably don't have a theatre context. Therefore, if they're watching a DVD, it may well be they're not taking into account that that's a larger performance than that actor would give on screen. Therefore, it's probably a risk for the actor that they need to take. From the writer's point of view, there's obviously a worry that if you made it available on DVD, that will diminish the chance of it being turned into a film. So an agent won't take a risk in that. But I think we need to keep moving this along. Now, it was a blessing in disguise, actually, because actually I think one of the things about NT Live is it's great to watch it in a collection of people and watching it on a big screen, which fills your field of vision. So we were probably rescued from a slightly more sort of etiolated experience. But they go into our archive, and you can watch those in our archive. Like, we capture every performance, and you can go down to our archive and watch it. And the next thing we're going to do is just to see if we can get people to accept that archive should be available in different circumstances. Now, if you put it online, you've got the same problems you had before, that it's unregulated access to it, and therefore it's going to be seen in a context that the people who made the work don't want to see it. But it feels like every 6 months or so we need to kind of nibble away at that. But yeah, I agree with your fundamental proposition. And I think the next stage is to make the archive available in educational settings.
One last question. Up there.
Could I, sorry, change it slightly, could I ask about the controversy about the musicians in Warhorse?
Sure.
You could comment on that.
Just that as an open question, or do you want to?
Yeah, no.
Yes, absolutely.
It's quite dull.
Up until 2010, the National Theatre's agreement and policy, its agreement with the MU, was that it was a sort of ideological religious thing, really, quasi-religious, which was that where music could be played live, it would be played live. So if the composer needed a symphonic score, then couldn't realistically have a symphony orchestra, so therefore that would be recorded. But if the music was capable of being played live, then it would be played live. And most often, this was therefore played live by musicians sitting in band rooms, piped through to the stage, through the auditorium. So for most productions in the Cottesloe, the band would be in the band room underneath the stage. Pretty much all the productions in the Littleton, except for musicals or where the band was integrated in the action, like with Leola recently. With the Olivier, much more possible to have the band up high on either side, which is glorious and wonderful. But of the £1 million or so a year that National Theatre spends on music, it felt odd to be hiring people to sit in band rooms, completely unknown to the public. But that's the circumstances in which Warhorse was put on. Adrian Sutton, who composed it, was given a brief by the directors Tom Morris and Marianne Elliott to produce an enormous symphonic score to go alongside the John Tams folk music, which is performed by the songman and the company of actors. So what he did was to take the 5 musicians that was doled out by the music department and have them play on top of a score that he recorded. And that was the status quo. And when we transferred it into the West End, we did it within 8 days of its closing here. So there was no time to reconsider that. And then when we came back to look at that, Tom Morris was very keen to say to me, oh, come on, let's do something about the musicians. It's a bit silly, they're just sitting there in the band room. We see them on stage for 2.5 minutes. And I, to my regret, said, I think we should just leave it alone. And I say I regret that because actually that would have been the moment to tackle it. And just say, we should spend our music budget in the way in which is artistically best, which means artistically best is where you can see the musicians play. So in other words, when we do things like musicals like Princess, or we have integrate music into the action. That's glorious and wonderful. To employ musicians to turn up every night to play in a way that the audience simply doesn't know whether they're on tape or not is a bit daft. You better spend your money on musicians being celebrated for doing their thing. So we had conversations with the MU about this, and they gave us very specific and repeated invitations to make an offer. And that's come to naught. But having grasped the issue, we felt in all good conscience, and as custodians of public money, that doesn't sound too pious, spending £250,000 a year on 5 musicians sitting in a band room, being piped through to the auditorium for 10 minutes and appearing on stage for 2 minutes, and no other production worldwide, including the one on Broadway that won 6 Tonys, has ever had live musicians. And they weren't wanted by the directors or the composer. Well, it's uncomfortable, but nonetheless it needs to be addressed. There's nothing in that is coming from a charged up and ideological position. We love music, we love musicians, we just want to do it in the best circumstance, and not to be trapped by the rules of the past, I suppose, really, which are basically protective of, one sympathises with the trade union, but if you look at the control that the MU effectively has over the way of artistic products, and the way in which music is used in plays, I don't think that should carry on. There's not a control that back to the Technicians Union has, or certainly nowhere near the control that Equity tries to have or could possibly have. So I think, yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it probably makes us look a bit bad, but we're not doing it from a particularly hard-nosed point of view. We just think it's the responsible thing to do. And we've run into a controversy, and we just have to weather that. The musicians went to the High Court to seek an interim injunction to be put back in the show, and the High Court turned it down, as they always do turn things like that down. And we're about to go into alternative dispute resolution, which I'm really glad, because we can sort this out and just sort of carry on. But every now and then, not to accept the status quo can look to be combative. It's not coming from a particularly combative place. It can look combative, but I think we need to do that, because if we look around as who's paid what, sometimes the disparities outrage me. The amount that actors are paid in so many of the theatres up and down the country outrages me. I want us to pay actors better. And sometimes one finds oneself in a position holding the ring, really, as to who gets paid what. And I think, it's much easier not to seek any kind of dispute and just say, oh, well, it is what it is, and they're the union rules. But if we want to change things, then sometimes we need to make a bit of a noise about them and try and change them. So, long answer. Boring.
No, thank you very much, Nick. I think that's all we've got time for, but thank you so much for this.